Patricia, as an undergraduate, went to the University of California at San Diego, where she was, in fact, a student of David Hoff. And more recently, she got her PhD at the University of California at Irvine. And even more recent than that, she was a postdoc, right, at, I want to say Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. And then she came here to Monmouth. And this summer she's going to be the visiting faculty for the study abroad program in Angers, living in the apartment that Nabil and I both lived in for a stretch of time.
Next summer, 2015.
Next summer, 2015. So hopefully it'll be a little pleated by then, and the noise won't be so bad. So, anyhow, it's really terrific. This is a terrific topic, and intimacy of the Sultan's palace, photography, power, and authority. And I'll let Patricia take over.
Thank you, John, for the introduction and for inviting me here today. The title of my talk is taken from the photographer Gabriel Veyre's autobiography of his years of living and working with the Sultan Abdulaziz prior to the establishment of the French Protectorate. When the Moroccan Sultan Abdulaziz hired the French photographer Gabriel Veyre as his private photography instructor in 1901, photography had been in existence for 60 years. It had spread globally, and it seemed as though photographers had left no corner of the world untouched. Photographs of ancient ruins in the Middle East, cities in Africa, villages in China, and the native populations of the Americas circulated in journals, postcards, and albums. By the turn of the century, advances in photographic technology allowed for more rapid development of prints, mass production, and the ability to publish images and text on the same page. Several years earlier, the Lumiere brothers in France had used their expertise in photography to develop the cinematograph at approximately the same time that Thomas Edison's kinetoscope and Edison moving picture machine debuted in America. Photography existed in color, in motion, alongside print, as a professional occupation and an amateur pastime. Photography had thus become a part of everyday life in much of the world, with the exception of Morocco. When Abdulaziz brought Veyre to Morocco, his decision influenced the future of Moroccan and French history. Veyre, who had spent years traveling the world as a representative of the Lumiere brothers, was fascinated by Morocco. He accepted the offer and left France for the country that would become his home for 35 years until his death in 1936. At first glance, Veyre's actions as photographer and diplomat exemplify the French policy of indirect conquest. In advance of direct conquest, France turned to a new style of imperialism that involved indirect involvement in Morocco. This new style of peaceful penetration, a title that hid the violent and aggressive nature of French conquest and colonization, focused on an indirect and gradual method of colonizing through extended cultural and economic influence rather than direct military conquest. As a photographer and cinematographer, in many ways Veyre characterized the cultural ideals that the French hoped would influence political relations. Veyre's tombstone, which claims for him the distinction of being, quote, the first precursor of French civilization to Morocco, and his position as the recipient of the Legion of Honor. He received the Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur in the 1910s and the Général de la Légion d'honneur in 1932 for his role as, quote, the first pioneer of French civilization in Morocco, reinforces this interpretation. And at the awards ceremony in the 1930s, his private role within the Sultan's palace was emphasized for the significance that it had in establishing the public relationship. And Georges Louis, who was director of the newspaper La Vigie Marocaine, said, quote, the confidence inspired by Dr. Veyre, which earned him 6 years in the court instead of the 3 months originally planned, strongly contributed to the court hearing French official voices, even expecting them. it was like a sentimental base added to our politics. However, such an interpretation overlooks the instrumental role played by Sultan Abdulaziz in bringing photographic technology to Morocco and using this technology for his own purposes. Abdulaziz came to power in 1894 as a young teenager after the death of his father, Sultan Hassan I. His father's trusted advisor, Ahmed, served as regent until he passed away in 1900, leaving a young Abdulaziz in charge of the nation. These early years of Abdulaziz's independent reign were marked by trial and error, as the Sultan attempted to maintain Morocco's status as one of the region's last independent nations. By bringing Veyre to his court, Abdulaziz defied existing practices in Morocco that had limited photography in the majority of the country for political, cultural, and religious reasons since the technology's invention. In doing so, Abdulaziz played a crucial role in bringing specific European technology in the form of photography to Morocco, and determining when, where, and how this symbol of Moroccan modernity entered into society. While interpretations of Abdulaziz tend to focus on his failures of a sultan that led to the signing of the Abd al-Aziz in 1906, an act which opened the internal regions of Morocco to European trade, his abdication in 1908, and to an increased European presence in Moroccan politics and economics, which ended with the establishment of the French and Spanish protectorates in 1912, an examination of photography within the Sultan's reign and the cultural and political connections to this technology offers us the opportunity to focus on the process of the Sultan's politics in the early years of his rule, rather than simply the outcome. Avoiding an anachronistic reading of the Sultan's regime provides a more thorough understanding of his ruling era, clarifies how Abdulaziz fell out of favor with much of the ulama and Moroccan citizens, and returns Moroccans to the history of the colonial era. The camera is of particular importance in a reassessment of Sharifian or pre-Protectorate Morocco. As a representation of European technology and modernity, Abdulaziz's decision to bring photography to the country, merge it with existing Moroccan traditions, such as religious parades, and use it to reinterpret the image of the royal harem, demonstrates the Sultan's attempts to integrate European forms of modernity in the country on his own terms. At the same time, Gabriel Veyre used photography as a tool for political negotiations between France and Morocco, and as an instrument in challenging the predominant characterization of Morocco as a backwards country, led by an incompetent and ignorant sultan. Although Veyre participated in the founding of the French Protectorate, his photographs reveal his admiration and ever-changing conceptions of Morocco and the Sultan. The Sultan's use and adaptation of the camera also challenges European ideals of what constituted European, or Western, and non-Western art in the colonial era. The French categorized photography, cinema, and to a large extent painting, particularly portrait painting, as European arts, while Moroccans were encouraged to strengthen a more traditional craft economy: carpet weaving, leather, pottery, tile making, and ceramics. And this divide is further challenged by the establishment of photography studios in the early years of the Protectorate by Moroccan Jews. While contemporary observers dismiss the Sultan's interest in photography as indicative of his inability to run the country, or as focusing more on his own private amusement than the management of Morocco, I'd like instead to examine how the Sultan's decision to bring photography to Morocco can be interpreted as a larger part of his policy of incorporating European ideas into Moroccan society. By recognizing the camera as a symbol of technology, one that the Sultan controlled rather than was controlled by, the years of Abdulaziz's reign demonstrate a transformation in Moroccan tactics towards European domination. And I'd also like to think about the ways in which the camera, although represented as a European symbol of modernity at this time, is not a completely European technology, as the 11th century Arab scientist Ibn al-Haytham's work in optics contributed to the development of the modern camera and its precursors. Rather than completely resisting what he viewed as a futile battle against European powers, or wholeheartedly embracing a European model of society and political rule, Abd al-Aziz began incorporating these traditions into the country and therefore determined by the terms by which European and Moroccan goods, technologies, and peoples would interact within Morocco. This also demonstrated the extent to which, by 1901, the camera had become what Christopher Piney has described as a, quote, globally disseminated and locally appropriated medium. Although the camera entered Morocco as a decidedly European technology, through the collaboration of Sultan Abd, the camera transformed into an expression of modern Morocco. And as Jonathan Katz has demonstrated, the idea that Moroccans were hostile to technology prior to the establishment of the Protectorate in 1912 is a European construction. Moroccans did not reject technology or science, and as the Sultan shows, transformed and used these technologies to formulate new concepts and new demonstrations of Moroccan power and authority. Ultimately, Abd al-Aziz failed in his attempt to integrate his version of technology and modernity into Moroccan society. Such an incorporation of European goods did not reach beyond his court, highlighting the growing distance between the Sultan and his subjects that eventually led to his abdication. Combined with crop failure, starvation, and the disapproval of individuals who were taxed for the first time under reforms created by Abd al-Aziz, the Sultan's interest in the camera and all it represented led some Moroccans to question his legitimacy as their ruler. The Sultan's court became the center of European interests at the turn of the century. Representatives of different European nations came to the court in order to gain Abd al-Aziz's favor and earn political and economic power. The interior of the court gained attention throughout Morocco and Europe as a site filled with objects previously unknown or forbidden in Morocco. Numerous Europeans and Moroccans spent their days within the palace, particularly within the area known as the Court of Amusements, putting on shows and participating in the Sultan's numerous hobbies. The Sultan's palace in Marrakesh was situated close to the Kasbah, where the military lived and where Veyre would establish his home. Inside the high palace walls lived the Sultan, the female members of his harem, and of his father's harem. The court, where the Sultan passed most of his days with members of his entourage and with Europeans affiliated with the palace, remained separated from the interior of the palace where the harem lived. With the exception of Thursdays, when the Sultan spent the day in the court with his family, Europeans spent most of their time in the palace in this courtyard, which contained Veyre's studio. Of all the items in the court, however, it was the camera that garnered the most attention from Abd al-Aziz. According to Harper's Weekly correspondent W.G. Fitzgerald, quote, "There were fireworks and bullfights, circuses and zoos, telephones, telegraphs, and wireless. Toy railroads, too, for the palace grounds, with fire balloons, bicycles for the ladies of the harem, automobiles, and motorboats for the lakes of the Starry Pavilion. Cinematograph shows were vaguely foreshadowed, as well as horse races, tennis courts, and such games as golf and billiards. And for the great silent saloons, bedsteads, and big grandfather's clocks with pianos and musical boxes. For dull evenings, conjurers and vaudeville entertainers were promised from London and Paris, as well as wonderful ventriloquists and marionette shows that would set the court ascream. Now observe, it was precisely all those things, as if all those things had descended on Moses in the wilderness, but the camera came first. As indicated by the widespread interest in the contents of the Sultan's Court of Amusements, whose activities were reported regularly throughout newspapers in Europe and America, observers took Abd al-Aziz's actions within the court as an indication that the Sultan was young and inexperienced. Foreign observers focused on the proliferation of previously unknown goods to criticize the Sultan. Moroccans viewed the court of amusements as evidence that Europeans had overtaken the Sultan. As I argue, however, Abd al-Aziz attempted to use these goods as a way of bringing together Moroccan tradition and European modernity. While the court came to represent the extravagance of the Sultan and his incompetence to outside viewers, it maintained a strong political significance. This was where Abd al-Aziz met with his most trusted advisors, communicated and negotiated with foreigners, and even introduced his harem to European civilization in the form of these new technologies and goods. And Veyre would often complain that after the harem used his photography material, it would be returned back to him broken and damaged and oftentimes very dirty. But they were regularly using and participating in the Sultan's new hobbies and activities. By analyzing how Abd al-Aziz made use of photography, we see that the Sultan attempted to gain control over European innovations in Morocco and use these inventions to create a new image of Morocco at home and abroad. Although he was unsuccessful in melding Moroccan and European interests outside of the court of amusements, and eventually dethroned in part for his attempt to do so, Abd al-Aziz's legacy should be presented in a more nuanced light that emphasizes his efforts rather than his failure. By examining the political process of increasing European influence in Morocco, rather than solely concentrating on the outcome, we can see Moroccans as actors in the process of negotiating and attempting to control European relations rather than helpless bystanders. Abd al-Aziz maintained control over what and where Gabriel Veyre and John Avery, an English photographer in residence for a brief period, could photograph. And I don't have time today to go into the nationalistic rivalries that existed between Veyre and Avery, but their battles for influence in the Sultan's favor highlights the importance of photography in the political battles for European power and domination in Morocco. The Sultan originally limited the photographer's activities to the court of amusements and the interior of the palace. Within the palace, Veyre and Avery recorded the Sultan's daily activities, and the Sultan practiced his own photographic skills. In this image, we see one of many portraits of the Sultan taken by Veyre. In it, the Sultan stands against an ornate backdrop of leaves, flowers, and geometric designs. His folded arms hold a whip, and he gazes into the distance. In this image, Abd al-Aziz appears serious and contemplative. Although the Sultan insisted upon European dress for visitors to the palace, which was a marked departure from his father's policy of Europeans and Moroccans alike outfitting themselves in Moroccan clothing, the Sultan himself maintained traditional Moroccan wear both in and out of the palace. And the white garment worn by the Sultan remained a symbol of Moroccan royal authority that dated back to the 16th century. This visual contrast between Veyre's clothing and Abd al-Aziz's robe demonstrates that the Sultan did not resist European influence in the same way as his father, who insisted upon Moroccan attire for everyone, including visiting Europeans, and instead endeavored to manage the symbols of the European impact on the country. Abd al-Aziz did not stand idly by as his country fell deeper and deeper under European influence, but rather act as an arbiter between what he believed to be an inevitable European penetration and Moroccan tradition. In an unpublished interview after his dethronement, Abd al-Aziz reminds the interview that, quote, "The Quran calls for the Sultan to see to superior force," end quote. After several months of restricting photography to the palace, the Sultan decided to allow the first public photographs of Morocco during his official parade marking a religious holiday. And we can also see in these photographs the evolution of Veyre's perception and image of the Sultan. Here's an image of the Sultan along with some Europeans, and about to ascend the ramp is his Minister of War riding bicycles within the harem, or excuse me, within the court of amusements. And the Sultan had refused to remove his jedla, remove his robe, in order to ride the bicycles, and so they imported a woman's bicycle for him, so that it would be easier for him to get on and off, but he refused once he was told that this was a bicycle.
I'm told they're called step-throughs when I...
Step-throughs.
I just call mine a step-through bike.
And a chain guard.
And much of Veyre's early photography focuses on these amusements, but after a year within the Sultan's court, his emphasis shifts. He begins to photograph the Sultan not as this large, curious child as he imagined Abd al-Aziz when he first entered into Morocco, but as the leader and the representative of Morocco when meeting with foreign dignitaries. And as I said, after several months of photography being restricted to within the palace walls, the Sultan decided to incorporate photographs into an official religious parade. This action, which came upon the heels of several skirmishes with the French that had preoccupied the Sultan for several days, embodied the coming together of Moroccan and European technologies and traditions, a union forged and solidified by Abd al-Aziz himself. Such public displays of pageantry in Morocco demonstrated the authority of the Sultan, in addition to celebrating the nation's Muslim heritage. The Sultan reasserted his position as the Moroccan leader, as rebel tribes, the Sultan's brothers, the religious leaders, and European powers all questioned his legitimacy and ability to rule. This context makes such a public display of bringing together Moroccan tradition and authority with this new technology all the more striking. At the end of March 1901, the Sultan requested Veyre to document his review of troops during a religious holiday. Muslim troops responded to the introduction of this previously shunned machine for image making on a religious holiday by verbally abusing the photographers, despite the Sultan's efforts at integrating his religious procession with the public overturning of the ban of this photography. And this is a quote from Gabriel Veyre. "If, for the Moroccans, it is their Easter celebration, for us Europeans, it is a photography celebration. It is the first time in Moroccan history that photographers have been authorized to publicly bring out their cameras. What a scandal this created among the troops. The interpreter explained to me the insults that they threw at our faces, since I still do not understand anything." In spite of these menaces, the Sultan's orders were respected. The English photographer had an 8x24 and a hand camera. Dr. Linares had a 9x12, as did Mr. Fabres, who had been here for 4 or 5 months. Although many Moroccans met Veyre's cameras with derision, either out of confusion over this new method of replicating vision, frustration with Veyre's intrusion into a religious parade, or hostility for the European modernity that it represented, it was Abd al-Aziz himself who determined when and how the photograph should be introduced to his country, and who dealt with the repercussions of this decision. The Sultan's decision to have Veyre work outside the palace walls moved photography from the private confines of the Sultan's palace to the public site of Moroccan custom and pageantry. In this image, Sultan Abdulaziz sits atop his horse, followed by a Moroccan carrying an umbrella, the official sign of the Sultan. And here's a closer image of the parade. The Sultan is the only person on horseback, elevating him above the other men and connoting his authority over them. An exclusively male crowd, possibly members of the military judging by their swords, has cleared a wide passageway for the Sultan alongside the city walls. Veyre's vantage point is from the inside of this crowd. These images introduce the viewer to a new side of the Sultan, one that had been ignored in popular reports in Morocco and abroad in favor of a representation of the Sultan as a puppet of foreign governments and Ba'amed, and as a child incapable of thinking or acting on his own. Instead, they reaffirmed the Sultan's power and authority at a moment in which Moroccans and Europeans alike questioned it. These crowds of admiring Moroccans would, however, a few years later, turn into protesters demanding Abd al-Aziz's abdication. In addition to the Sultan's appreciation of photography for its relation to reality, which is what originally drove him to invite Veyre to Morocco, the Sultan also relied on photography to create an illusion of authority that stood in stark contrast to his gradual loss of control. This decision to move photography into the public realm by integrating it into a Moroccan religious ceremony suggested a desire to control how and when such technology could enter and function within the Moroccan public sphere. Such a shift represented Abd al-Aziz's policy of negotiation and adaptation. While this action solidified Abd al-Aziz's authority in several ways, captured on paper as a visual reminder of his position, and as a marker of his ability to control the European intrusion into Morocco, it also contributed to the popular uprisings against the European intrusion into the nation and eventually his dethronement. Abd al-Aziz's actions, designed to bring together Morocco and Europe, backfired and caused the loss of his status and eventually of his position. And I'd like to close with a letter that highlights Abd al-Aziz's efforts at negotiating between Europe and Morocco. His efforts to highlight and encourage technological and cultural exchanges between the two regions are found in a letter to French President Émile Loubet. While in Morocco, Veyre maintained a position as the unofficial liaison between Abd al-Aziz and the French government. Additionally, Veyre taught the Sultan French, kept Abd al-Aziz informed of the false information about Morocco being reported in French journals, introduced members of the French Mission Scientifique to the Sultan, and accompanied French journalists to the Court of Amusements, and wrote a letter on the Sultan's behalf to the French President of the Republic in 1905. This letter, reproduced in French journals, introduced Veyre as the recipient in long conversations with the Sultan and as a Frenchman following his duty of peace. Although always claiming his loyalty to France, Veyre certainly grew sympathetic to the Sultan during his time in Morocco. This letter emphasized the Moroccan desire to remain independent from France while maintaining scientific and commercial exchanges between the countries. And it's rather long, but I think it's fairly important, so if you'll bear with me. And this is the part from Veyre, quote, "To the President of the French Republic in Paris, Dear President, I have had these last few days several long conversations with His Majesty the Sultan Abd al-Aziz, and I believe it my duty as a Frenchman and a friend of peace to send you the following message, which summarizes exactly the thoughts and desires of the Sharifian Majesty, which he has approved." Here's the part from Abd al-Aziz. "French diplomacy has taken an unfortunate route and has created regrettable misunderstandings and severe conflicts between our governments. If it believes Morocco to be in ruins, and if it thinks there is nothing more to do than annex us under a form disguised as a protectorate, similar to those in Tunisia and Madagascar. As we have done in the past, Morocco means to stay free in the future. It is necessary that you know this and that it is said loudly throughout Europe. Our sacred text, the Quran, wisely interpreted, is favorable towards all types of progress, since it states that Allah is the source of everything good. We are interested in progress in agriculture, industry, and administration. We willingly ask France, our neighbor, for her advice and her assistance, but only when we feel the need and the ability to carry it out. However, we cannot allow the imposition of transformations and opportunities of which we are the best judges, and even more of the foreign officials who take the place of our indigenous chiefs. With this attack against its independence, Morocco will respond with a general uprising that will quickly assume the shape of the old holy wars of Islam against the infidels. We will gladly welcome worthy French citizens, people of science and commerce, who come here. They will be able to fully realize their initiative and make their capital. But this will be on a purely private basis, under our control and with our authorization. We have noted with pleasure that the most eminent men of the French Republic have spoken in peace. We hope that through a public declaration, with the same honesty and good intentions as we have shown, that you will dispel Moroccan worries over plots and preliminary maneuvers of a conquest. Praise be to God, and may peace reign between France and Morocco. This letter, I believe, highlights many of the efforts that we've seen Abd al-Aziz making through his use of photography and of photographers. The compatibility of science and technology with Moroccan tradition and religion. The encouragement of French citizens to come to Morocco on a, quote, purely private basis under our control and with our authorization. During and after his reign, the Sultan emphasized what he viewed as inevitable changes in Moroccan relations with Europeans. In a discussion with Veyre over the future of Morocco, Abd al-Aziz stated, quote, I understand perfectly, and you know better than anyone, that my country can no longer remain as it has been until now, and that I must open it more to Europeans. After his dethronement in 1908, he maintained that his decision to bring European civilization and customs into Morocco benefited both peoples. Quote, I was good for my country and for the Europeans. I tried to introduce European civilization to my country. I believed I was doing the right thing, and I always hoped that these powers would be our friends. The former Sultan considered that it was he who introduced European civilization to his country, not the Europeans, thus highlighting his role as an intermediary, not a pawn, of European powers vying for control of Morocco. As we've seen, Abd al-Aziz also provided religious justifications for his actions, for bringing together Europe and Morocco, and eventually capitulating to European forces. While these interviews provide Abd al-Aziz's reflections on his era after his abdication, there is no doubt that he altered the role of the Sultan in the relationship between the Moroccan government and European governments. Ultimately, Abd al-Aziz's efforts to establish fair and equitable exchanges failed, and the French and Spanish took advantage of civil unrest and their military strength to establish a protectorate that would last for 40 years.